People often mistakenly believe that stripping away a roof can erase a person from existence, completely unaware that some of the most magnificent legacies are actually seated in the very ashes the world has recklessly thrown away. The freezing wind howled through the vast, empty expanse of the supermarket parking lot, dropping the ambient temperature to a bitter 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Thin sheets of ice formed rapidly across the cracked asphalt, reflecting the harsh, flickering neon lights of the closed storefronts. Inside a rusted, sputtering station wagon that smelled heavy. People often mistakenly believe that stripping away a roof can erase a person from existence, completely unaware that some of the most magnificent legacies are actually seated in the very ashes the world has recklessly thrown away. The freezing wind howled through the vast, empty expanse of the supermarket parking lot, dropping the ambient temperature to a bitter 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Thin sheets of ice formed rapidly across the cracked asphalt, reflecting the harsh, flickering neon lights of the closed storefronts. Inside a rusted, sputtering station wagon that smelled heavily of cheap gasoline and damp, decaying upholstery, Eleanor Vance sat perfectly still. She was 71 years old. Her worn hands, heavily calloused and deeply scarred from decades of silent servitude, gripped the cracked leather of the steering wheel. These were hands that had scrubbed thousands of square feet of hardwood floors, tended endlessly to meticulously manicured rose gardens, folded towering mountains of crisp laundry, cooked tens of thousands of hot meals, and quietly maintained a pristine, sprawling household that was never truly hers. She did not weep. She did not scream. She simply breathed. After 44 years of absolute, unwavering devotion, she had been discarded like a piece of broken furniture. For more than 4 decades, she had been the silent anchor, the invisible, unbreakable backbone of a hollow marriage built entirely on psychological control and financial abuse. Her husband, Arthur Sterling, was a ruthless man who expertly cloaked his venomous manipulation under the respectable guise of financial resourcefulness. He was 73 years old, wealthy, arrogant, and relentlessly cruel. Over the long, suffocating years, Arthur had methodically slid complex legal documents across polished mahogany tables, softly demanding her signature for high-risk refinancing, for elaborate corporate business loans, for questionable asset transfers, and for the complete relinquishment of her spousal rights. She had signed them all with blind, obedient trust, believing foolishly in the sanctity of their union, slowly surrendering every single ounce of her legal protection until the steel trap finally snapped shut. Tonight, the fragile illusion had shattered completely. Arthur had preemptively changed the heavy brass locks on the massive oak doors of their lavish estate. He had stood comfortably on the warmly lit, heated porch of the property, safely shielded from the winter frost, his face a terrifying mask of chilling, calculated indifference. A cruel, triumphant smirk played on his thin lips as he stared down at the woman who had given him her youth, her energy, and her soul. He callously tossed a single battered leather suitcase down the concrete steps. It landed at her feet with a hollow, sickening thud. "You have absolutely nothing left here," Arthur had stated coldly. He had looked her up and down, taking in her faded wool coat and her tired posture, his sharp eyes filled with a deep, predatory disdain. He enjoyed her sudden destitution. He relished his absolute power. He paused for a long, agonizing moment before delivering his final, meticulously calculated blow. "Take that pathetic little key and go rot in your grandmother's graveyard of worthless scrap paper." He was referring with utmost contempt to the dilapidated farm in Oak Haven County, a forgotten, overgrown piece of land situated deep within the rugged Appalachian Mountains of Tennessee.
The property, spanning exactly 4 overgrown acres, had been inherited from her grandmother Josephine. Arthur had always fiercely despised the place, endlessly mocking its peeling white paint, its dangerously sagging front porch, and the massive, endless stacks of dusty, moldering boxes piled high inside its rotting walls. To him, it was garbage. It was a filthy monument to failure. Eleanor had stood at the bottom of the steps, looking up at his arrogant face, silently memorizing the stark, unforgiving cruelty of a man she had served for 44 years. The wind had whipped her gray hair across her stoic face. She did not beg. She did not break. She simply bent down, picked up the handle of the battered suitcase, and turned her back on him forever. She walked away. Now, sitting alone in the heavy isolation of the deserted parking lot, exactly 50 miles away from the estate, the biting, relentless cold seeped through the thin fabric of her coat. Her joints ached with a deep, throbbing, rhythmic pain. The frost was slowly creeping across the windshield, obscuring her view of the desolate highway ahead. Slowly, deliberately, with movements that demanded immense physical effort, she opened her frayed, faded leather wallet. Under the dim, yellowish interior light of the old station wagon, she systematically counted the crumpled, worn bills. 1 $5 bill, 10 $1 bills, 12 quarters. Exactly $18. That was the entire, pathetic sum total of her existence. 18 miserable, scattered dollars after a lifetime of grueling, unacknowledged labor. A lesser person, a weaker mind, would have completely crumbled under the sheer, terrifying, suffocating weight of this absolute destitution, screaming at the heavens for justice. But Eleanor simply folded the bills with steady fingers, slid them back into the dark recess of the wallet, and stared blankly out into the freezing, impenetrable black night. The marriage was dead. She was free. The silence inside the cramped cabin of the car was absolute, broken only by the erratic, dying clicking of the failing heater and her own steady, measured breathing. Her face remained a portrait of stoic dignity. She reached out with stiff, freezing fingers and firmly grasped the cold metal of the ignition key. She turned it sharply. The old engine sputtered violently, coughed out a thick cloud of exhaust, and finally roared to a fragile, vibrating life. Sitting in the freezing, gasoline-scented vehicle with her last $18 to her name, she shifted the heavy gears and pointed the dim headlights toward the dark, misty, towering hills of Oak Haven, completely unaware that the desolate, forgotten grave waiting for her was actually a massive, impenetrable chest hiding the secrets of tens of thousands of lives.
The heavy oak doors of the Oak Haven County Courthouse groaned as Eleanor pushed them open. The worn marble floors echoed beneath her cheap, scuffed boots. She walked past the heavily armed county sheriffs, the whispering legal clerks, the bustling lawyers in their expensive wool suits, and the curious, pitying stares of the townsfolk who immediately recognized the defeated posture of a newly discarded woman. She stood tall. Her posture remained rigidly straight. She approached the thick glass of the tax assessor counter, her calloused hands resting calmly on the cold brass railing. From the depths of her frayed coat pocket, her old cellular phone vibrated aggressively. It was a voicemail. She pressed the device to her ear, listening to the smooth, rich, drippingly arrogant voice of Arthur. "You will freeze out there in the dirt, Eleanor," Arthur drawled with a viciously mocking tone. "When you finally realize you are absolutely nothing without me, do not bother crawling back." She ended the call. She deleted the message without a single flinch. The county clerk, a young woman with tired eyes, pulled up the dusty property records for grandmother Josephine's 4-acre estate. The farm was dangerously close to seizure, abandoned to the relentless rot of the Appalachian wilderness, threatened by an unpaid, overdue county fee. The balance to clear the delinquency and secure your full legal ownership is exactly $7, the clerk stated sympathetically. Eleanor opened her battered wallet. She bypassed the worn $5 bill and extracted 7 single, heavily creased $1 bills from her meager $18 survival fund. She slid the paper money slowly beneath the security glass. The clerk stamped the heavy official parchment with a resounding thud, handing the freshly sealed deed back to the old woman. "It is all yours, Mrs. Vance," the clerk offered softly. Eleanor folded the deed. She now possessed exactly $11 to her name, but she finally owned the very ground beneath her feet. She drove the sputtering station wagon 9 miles up the winding, treacherous dirt roads of Oak Haven, the heavy fog rolling over the dense pine forests. When the rusted vehicle finally crested the final ridge, the grim reality of her inheritance materialized through the thick gray mist. It was a spectacular ruin. The farmhouse sat on a small rise, heavily battered by decades of harsh mountain storms. The front porch sagged terribly, dropping nearly 6 inches on the western corner where the wooden support beams had completely rotted away. The white exterior paint had peeled off in massive, brittle strips, leaving the underlying raw pine exposed to the brutal elements. The yard was a jungle of dead, frozen weeds, standing nearly 3 feet tall. She stepped out into the biting wind. Using the heavy, rusted iron key, she unlocked the warped front door and pushed it violently open with her shoulder. The smell of intense dampness, ancient dust, and decaying wood violently assaulted her senses. The interior was a cavernous, forgotten tomb. Every single square foot of the living room, the narrow hallways, and the parlor was completely choked with hundreds upon hundreds of heavy, sagging cardboard boxes. They were stacked dangerously high. They formed narrow, claustrophobic walls of cardboard, towering up to the 8-foot ceilings, thickly coated in decades of undisturbed gray dust. Arthur always called this place a worthless, disgusting graveyard of paper. To any normal observer, it looked like the chaotic, filthy hoarding of a madwoman. Eleanor did not despair. She silently bypassed the towering mountains of boxes and made her way to the small, empty back bedroom. The ambient temperature inside the house hovered near 32 degrees Fahrenheit, a bone-chilling, unforgiving cold that radiated directly from the exposed hardwood floors. She methodically carried 3 moth-eaten, terribly thin wool blankets from the trunk of her car. She laid them directly on the freezing planks. There was no electricity. There was no running water. There was only the absolute crushing silence of the mountain isolation and the gnawing ache in her empty stomach. Eleanor lay down on the thin blankets, fully clothed in her coat, pulling her knees tightly to her chest to conserve her rapidly fading body heat. She closed her eyes, enduring the physical misery with the quiet, hardened stoicism of a woman who had survived 44 years of psychological torture. She was finally home. Deep in the night, a harsh, freezing rain began to violently assault the tin roof of the old farmhouse. The rhythmic drumming was deafening. Soon, a steady, freezing leak developed directly above the narrow hallway just outside her door. Eleanor rose silently in the pitch blackness. Ignoring the heavy darkness and the desolate ruin surrounding her, she calmly retrieved a severely chipped porcelain cup from her meager belongings and placed it directly under the freezing, dripping water. The hollow ping of the drops hitting the porcelain became a steady, hypnotic rhythm. She turned to walk back to her freezing bed, seeking just 1 hour of merciful sleep. Then, Right in the dead of the freezing night, a sudden, violent, tearing sound echoed through the shadows. A massive, waterlogged cardboard box in the corner had completely given way, its bottom tearing open with a sickening crunch, spilling its heavy, forgotten contents violently across the floorboards. The pale, gray light of the Appalachian dawn finally pierced through the deeply cracked, grime-covered window panes of the ruined parlor. The air inside the house was bitterly cold, hovering just below 29 degrees Fahrenheit, leaving a thin, visible mist with every breath Eleanor took. She stood completely silent in the center of the devastation. She did not massage her aching, stiff joints, nor did she shed a single tear for the luxurious, climate-controlled estate she had lost exactly 12 hours ago. She simply observed her new reality. With a calm, meticulous gaze, she began to conduct a thorough, unsentimental assessment of the decaying structure. Beneath the heavy layers of rotting floral wallpaper and the terrifying accumulation of black mold, her sharp eyes easily traced the massive, underlying skeleton of the old farmhouse. The primary support columns were forged from raw, solid oak. They measured a staggering 20 inches across, deeply anchored into a heavy riverstone foundation that remained perfectly, undeniably level despite weathering nearly a century of brutal mountain storms. Arthur had always mocked this place as a collapsing, worthless death trap. He was entirely wrong. The physical frame of the house was an absolute fortress, built with the quiet, enduring strength of the generations who had preceded her. Having satisfied herself with the structural integrity of the walls, Eleanor turned her intense, unwavering attention to the chaotic mountains of cardboard that choked the 15 by 20-foot living room. She stepped closer to the nearest towering stack, her scuffed leather boots crunching softly against the grit on the floor. She reached out a calloused hand. She deliberately wiped away a thick, suffocating blanket of gray dust from the side of a heavy, corrugated box. As the dirt fell away, a sudden, profound realization washed over her. These hundreds of boxes, previously dismissed by her cruel ex-husband and her greedy niece as the filthy, chaotic hoarding of a madwoman, were not stacked randomly at all. They were systematically, obsessively organized. Upon the side of every single container, written meticulously in Grandmother Josephine's elegant, unwavering blue ink, were precise, deeply specific historical designations. She read labels detailing the forgotten, winding dirt roads of the county, the official names of tiny, long-burned wooden churches, and the tragic, erased surnames of destitute families who had vanished completely from the valley. "These are not just old papers," she murmured quietly, her voice steady and resolute in the freezing air. Eleanor turned and walked slowly down the narrow, 3-foot-wide hallway toward the immediate source of the midnight collapse. The torrential, freezing rain had finally ceased, but a steady, rhythmic drip continued to fall from the severely compromised ceiling, splashing onto the warped oak floorboards. The waterlogged box, which easily weighed 40 pounds before the rain, had completely disintegrated during the night. It lay violently ruptured across the hallway. Its thick cardboard sides had dissolved into a useless, mushy pulp, spilling hundreds of yellowed, fragile documents into a dangerous, spreading puddle of freezing rainwater. Eleanor knelt directly onto the painfully cold, damp wood. The brutal chill immediately soaked through the thin fabric of her trousers, but she completely ignored the sharp, radiating pain in her arthritic knees. She began to work. With agonizingly slow, deliberate precision, she used her heavily scarred hands to gently separate the damp, fragile pages, lifting them carefully away from the destructive moisture and laying them out to dry on the surrounding, unaffected floorboards. Among the scattered debris, the torn side flap of the ruined box lay face up. It bore a single, ominous designation written in that familiar blue ink. "Unfinished," she read aloud, solemnly, her tone thick with a sudden, heavy grief. She continued her stoic labor, pulling thick, ancient property deeds, faded birth certificates, and crumbling census records from the icy puddle. Deep at the bottom of the ruined pile, safely protected beneath a heavy leather ledger, a small, solid object caught the weak morning light. It was cold, rigid, and completely unaffected by the water. She picked it up cautiously. Using the fraying, dry hem of her wool coat, Eleanor carefully wiped the wet dirt from its dark surface. It was an exceptionally rare, completely intact tintype photograph, an antique image permanently burned onto a thin, heavy sheet of iron coated in dark enamel. The picture depicted a hauntingly gaunt, unknown woman standing barefoot beneath the massive, sprawling branches of an ancient dogwood tree. The woman in the image wore ragged, violently torn clothing, her posture stiff, but her dark eyes blazed with a fierce, absolute, unyielding pride. A profound, absolute stillness consumed the freezing hallway. Eleanor recognized that identical, defiant posture. It was the exact same quiet dignity she herself had maintained while being cast out into the freezing night with only $18 in her pocket. This terrifying, towering mountain of boxes was absolutely not a graveyard of worthless scrap paper. It was a fortress of memory. She stared down on the haunted, piercing eyes of the unknown woman in the heavy tintype photograph for a very long, breathless moment. Then, with perfectly steady, deliberate fingers, she flipped the cold piece of metal over. The back of the iron plate was heavily rusted, but there, completely legible against the decay, were 4 bold, heavily underlined words written in grandmother's hand that caused Eleanor's heart to suddenly, violently stop beating. The 4 faded words were written with an absolute, terrifying clarity across the rusted iron back of the antique photograph. "Please find their families." Eleanor stared down at the elegant, sweeping cursive of her grandmother, feeling the immense, crushing weight of those 4 simple words settle heavily upon her tired shoulders. This was not a random plea left in the dark. It was a direct, undeniable command transmitted across the decades, cutting through the freezing air of the ruined parlor like a sharp, brilliant blade of light. She traced the raised, oxidized letters with her freezing, calloused thumb. For 44 years, she had meticulously managed the sprawling, perfectly sterile estate of a man who valued absolutely nothing but cold, hard currency and absolute dominance. She had spent her entire existence preserving the polished, empty illusion of Arthur Sterling, making sure his crystal glasses gleamed, his tailored wool suits were flawlessly pressed, and his massive, echo-filled mansion remained a flawless monument to his towering ego. That life was entirely gone. In its place stood a towering, chaotic mountain of forgotten history, a desperately fragile archive of human existence that was rapidly succumbing to the brutal, unforgiving dampness of the Appalachian winter. Eleanor placed the heavy iron tintype safely inside the deep, woolen pocket of her worn coat. She did not waste a single second lamenting her empty, violently growling stomach, nor did she acknowledge the sharp, radiating pain shooting through her 71-year-old joints. She rolled up her fraying sleeves. The ambient temperature inside the crumbling farmhouse lingered fiercely at 31 degrees Fahrenheit, but a sudden blazing fire of purpose had ignited deep within her stoic chest. She walked with deliberate, heavy steps through the maze of sagging cardboard boxes, making her way to the rotting wooden back door. She pushed it open against the howling wind, stepping out into the overgrown, frozen yard to inspect the dilapidated, leaning barn situated exactly 50 yards behind the main house. The barn was a dark, hollow shell of its former glory. Inside the freezing, dirt-floored structure, among rusted tractor parts and ancient, dry-rotted leather harnesses, Eleanor found her salvation. She unearthed 4 massive, heavy rolls of thick, industrial-grade plastic sheeting, a heavily rusted iron scraper with a surprisingly sharp edge, and a heavy galvanized steel bucket. She gathered the heavy supplies in her arms, entirely ignoring the sharp splinters of rotting wood that dug fiercely into her bare, unshielded forearms. She walked back to the house. The labor that followed was a grueling, agonizing testament to absolute, unyielding human endurance. Eleanor began to systematically dismantle the most dangerously waterlogged sections of the towering cardboard walls, lifting heavy 40-pound boxes filled to the brim with thick, ancient paper. She carried them one by one away from the leaking roof, her breath coming in short, visible white puffs of mist in the freezing air. She did not stop. She dragged the heavy 10-foot-long sheets of thick plastic across the damp, freezing floorboards, draped them meticulously over the newly organized stacks of fragile history, tucked the stiff edges tightly beneath the bottommost cartons to block the rising damp, and used her rusted iron scraper to violently strip the thick, creeping layers of green moss and toxic black mold from the surrounding oak baseboards. The brutal, repetitive friction of the heavy iron scraper against the hard oak quickly wore the thin, aging skin of her palms entirely raw. Thick, dark blood began to seep slowly from her cuticles. It smeared across the wooden handle of the scraper, mixing with the dark, ancient dirt of the farmhouse, but she simply wiped her damaged hands mechanically on the side of her trousers and continued to work. She was 71 years old, completely abandoned by her family, operating on exactly 0 hours of sleep and entirely without food, yet she labored with the terrifying, silent intensity of a soldier fortifying a sacred bunker. She worked for 6 solid, agonizing hours. Around noon, the heavy, rhythmic crunch of thick rubber tires rolling slowly over the frozen, rutted gravel driveway broke the absolute, isolated silence of the mountain morning. Eleanor paused her frantic scraping, remaining perfectly still on her bleeding knees, and listened. She slowly stood up, brushing the thick layer of wood shavings and dry rot from her coat, and walked cautiously toward the front grime-covered window. A rusted, faded blue pickup truck had parked near the sagging porch. A man stepped out into the freezing wind. He was Silas, the quiet, solitary carpenter from the lower valley, a man who possessed a deeply lined, weathered face and hands that were permanently stained with dark wood lacquer and heavy machine oil. He was 68 years old, carrying a heavy, worn leather tool belt slung over his broad, stooped shoulders. He did not knock. He simply walked to the back of his truck, effortlessly hoisted a massive 20-foot aluminum extension ladder, and carried it toward the side of the house. Eleanor opened the warped front door, stepping out onto the dangerously sagging porch to meet him. The freezing mountain wind whipped violently between them, carrying the sharp, bitter scent of pine needles and impending snow. "Good morning," Silas stated quietly, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Good morning," Eleanor replied evenly, keeping her posture rigidly straight. "I heard the heavy rain rolling through the valley last night," he noted gently, his eyes scanning the missing, rotting shingles on the highest peak of the steep roof. "It leaked," she confirmed calmly, offering absolutely no further complaint. "I will fix it," Silas murmured softly. He did not ask for a contract, he did not demand an hourly wage, and he did not bring up her sudden, highly public disgrace or her ruthless ex-husband. He simply turned away, positioned the heavy aluminum ladder firmly against the solid oak frame of the house, and began to climb. For the next 3 hours, the rhythmic booming sound of Silas's heavy steel hammer driving thick copper nails into fresh, waterproof cedar shingles echoed loudly through the cold, empty rooms of the farmhouse. Eleanor listened to the profound, striking contrast to the suffocating, silent psychological warfare she had endured for 44 years inside Arthur's massive, sterile mansion. Arthur would have never lifted a finger to help a desperate soul without a meticulously drafted contract designed to extract maximum devastating leverage. Silas, a stranger with worn boots and tired eyes, was currently bleeding his own warmth into the freezing sky just to protect an old woman from the rain. The hammering finally stopped.
Silas climbed down the ladder, packed his heavy tools back into the bed of his rusted truck, and walked to the driver's side door. Eleanor stepped off the porch, walking directly toward him across the frozen, dead weeds of the front yard. She reached slowly into her deep coat pocket, her bleeding, calloused fingers touching the remaining $11 of her pathetic, non-existent fortune. "I do not have much," she stated clearly, holding her head high. "Keep it," he replied gruffly, refusing to even look at her hand. "Thank you," she said softly. Silas gave a single slow nod, started his noisy engine, and drove away down the winding, fog-choked dirt road, leaving behind a completely watertight, secure sanctuary. With the terrifying threat of the freezing rain finally eliminated, Eleanor returned immediately to the massive, towering piles of debris in the rear parlor. Under the protective, waterproof shadow of the newly repaired roof, she began to move the final, heaviest stack of water-damaged boxes. She pushed the last heavy carton aside. Hidden entirely behind the massive wall of forgotten history, buried beneath decades of undisturbed gray dust and thick cobwebs, sat a massive, profoundly beautiful piece of antique furniture. It was a heavy, solid mahogany writing desk, intricately carved with curling wooden vines, measuring exactly 5 feet across and 3 feet deep. Eleanor approached it slowly. She ran her bruised, bleeding fingers lovingly across the thick, undisturbed layer of dust covering its expansive surface. It was a magnificent, powerful relic, utterly out of place amidst the terrifying decay of the ruined walls. She reached down and grasped the heavy, ornate brass handle of the primary center drawer. She pulled. It did not yield. The heavy wooden drawer was firmly locked, secured by a thick, oxidized brass keyhole that had not been turned in over 40 years. Eleanor's eyes narrowed in quiet, steely determination. She would not be stopped by a piece of rusted metal. She turned and walked purposefully back to the pile of supplies she had dragged from the freezing barn. She retrieved the heavy, solid iron crowbar. The tool was exactly 3 feet long, incredibly heavy, and completely coated in rough orange rust. She returned to the heavy mahogany desk, wedged the flat, wedged steel tip of the crowbar deeply into the incredibly tight, millimeter-thin gap between the drawer and the solid wooden frame, and gripped the heavy iron shaft with both of her bleeding, trembling hands. She took a deep breath. Using every single ounce of her remaining, fiercely guarded physical strength, she threw her entire body weight violently downward against the heavy iron bar. The solid mahogany wood groaned loudly in fierce protest, the sound echoing sharply off the peeling walls. "Give way," she muttered coldly through gritted teeth. She pushed harder. With a sudden, violent crack that sounded exactly like a dry gunshot in the empty room, the heavy, rusted brass locking mechanism violently shattered. The thick iron latch tore violently through the ancient wood, sending sharp, flying splinters scattering across the dusty floorboards. The heavy center drawer violently burst open, sliding out smoothly on its ancient, hidden wooden tracks. Eleanor dropped the heavy iron crowbar. It hit the wooden floorboards with a heavy, deafening clang. She stepped closer to the open drawer, her chest heaving with silent, exhausted exertion.
As the stale, trapped air of the enclosed space rapidly rushed out into the cold room, a sudden, profoundly intense aroma washed completely over her. It was the unmistakable, perfectly preserved scent of dry lavender. The powerful floral fragrance completely overpowered the aggressive, nauseating smells of black mold and rotting pine. Eleanor looked down into the dark, incredibly deep recess of the shattered drawer. There, resting perfectly undisturbed beneath 3 thick, leather-bound notebooks, completely covered in Grandmother Josephine's familiar, elegant blue ink, lay a single, pristine white envelope. It was thickly sealed with dark red wax. Eleanor reached down with a trembling, deeply scarred hand and gently lifted the heavy, expensive paper from its dark resting place. Her freezing fingers traced the smooth, unbroken surface of the wax seal, her sharp eyes scanning the front of the pristine envelope. The incredibly precise, familiar handwriting scrawled across the front in dark black ink immediately forced the exhausted, stoic 71-year-old woman to hold her breath in absolute stunning disbelief.
The inscription across the pristine white envelope was written in bold black ink, the elegant strokes perfectly unfaded by the 40 years they had spent trapped in the dark. For the one who returns when there is nowhere else to go. Eleanor stared at the terrifyingly prescient words. The heavy mahogany desk seemed to hum with the immense stored energy of a secret kept waiting for nearly half a century. With fingers that trembled violently against the bitter 29 degrees Fahrenheit air, she grasped the heavy paper. Her grandmother had known. She cracked the thick red wax seal. The brittle material snapped loudly in the quiet room. She pulled a densely written, perfectly preserved piece of heavy parchment from the envelope and unfolded it under the weak gray light filtering through the grime-covered window panes. "My dearest Eleanor," the letter began, the familiar handwriting instantly bridging a massive gap of 40 decades. "If you are reading this, the monster has finally shown his true face, and you have been completely stripped of the hollow illusion you called a home. I knew Arthur Sterling the exact second he stepped onto my porch 40 years ago. I saw the terrifying, calculated greed hiding deeply behind his expensive wool suits and his smooth, empty smiles." Eleanor stopped reading. She took a slow, agonizingly deep breath, feeling the crushing weight of her grandmother's supreme, piercing wisdom wash over her frozen body. Josephine had seen the absolute, undeniable truth when Eleanor had been completely blinded by youth, hope, and relentless psychological manipulation. "He called this place a graveyard," the letter continued, the ink pressing fiercely into the paper. "He wanted to bring in a clearance man, to load everything into a massive steel dumpster and throw it into a landfill just to sell these 4 acres of dirt. That is exactly why I banished him and your foolishly practical niece Beatrice from this property forever. I had to protect the truth. These boxes are not trash, Eleanor. They are the undeniable physical proof of thousands of erased lives." The letter meticulously detailed a horrifying century-old conspiracy. The local elites, the incredibly wealthy timber barons, and the deeply corrupt county officials had systematically stolen thousands of acres of fertile land from poor Appalachian farmers and displaced indigenous families. They had burned the official county records, completely erased the birth registries, and aggressively rewritten the history books to legitimize their massive theft. Josephine had spent her entire existence fighting back. She had quietly, obsessively traveled across hundreds of treacherous dirt mountain roads, visiting forgotten valleys and isolated, rotting cabins. She had collected the surviving original land deeds, the fragile birth certificates, the heavy iron family tintypes, and sworn handwritten testimonies of the dispossessed. She had hidden the entire erased history of the region inside hundreds of heavy cardboard boxes, trusting absolutely that one day her resilient granddaughter would return to protect it. A single warm tear escaped Eleanor's eye. It rolled slowly down her deeply lined cheek, cutting a clean, wet path through the thick layer of ancient gray dust covering her face. She did not sob, she did not wail, and she absolutely did not curse the heavens for her misfortune. She simply wiped the single tear away with the back of her bleeding, calloused hand, completely overwhelmed by the majestic, cross-time protection of a woman who had loved her fiercely enough to meticulously prepare for her absolute ruin. She carefully folded the letter and placed it securely in her chest pocket. Eleanor walked out to the rusted station wagon, the bitter wind biting her face, and drove 9 miles back into the small town of Oakhaven. She bypassed the imposing courthouse entirely and parked directly in front of the small red brick county library. She carried the rusted iron tintype and a single miraculously preserved land deed from the late 19th century inside, presenting them quietly at the front desk. Margaret was a 60-year-old librarian with kind eyes, neat silver hair, and a deep, passionate reverence for local history. "Where did you find this?" Margaret whispered breathlessly, her fingers tracing the heavy parchment of the deed with absolute stunning reverence. "The county has claimed for over 80 years that every single record from the Eastern Valley was completely destroyed in the Great Courthouse fire." "I have hundreds of boxes," Eleanor replied calmly. "They fill an entire farmhouse." Margaret immediately locked the heavy glass front doors of the public library, flipped the hanging sign to closed, and followed Eleanor back up the winding, treacherous mountain road in her own vehicle. When the librarian stepped onto the sagging porch and entered the freezing, dilapidated farmhouse, she dropped her heavy leather satchel directly onto the floorboards in absolute shock. They began to work. For the next 3 days, ignoring the freezing temperatures and surviving entirely on cheap canned soup brought by Margaret, the two women systematically cataloged the monumental discovery. They sorted through tens of thousands of original documents, categorizing fragile birth records by county, matching rare tintypes to handwritten family trees, and carefully flattening crumbling land grants that proved absolute legal ownership of stolen valleys measuring hundreds of thousands of acres. The archive was an absolute, undisputed triumph of human perseverance. Eleanor stood amidst the meticulously organized stacks, her hands still raw and heavily bandaged, feeling a profound, unshakable sense of peace. She had been cast out of a hollow, loveless mansion with merely $18, only to be crowned the sole guardian of an entire forgotten civilization. The emotional and spiritual significance of the archive was a priceless, soaring victory for the erased souls of the mountains. Yet the actual, undeniable monetary valuation of these tens of thousands of highly sought-after, completely original historical documents was about to register on a scale so astronomically massive that frantic, high-level experts from the state capitol were already packing their vehicles to drive straight through the pitch-black night.
The heavy black sport utility vehicles belonging to the National Historical Society rolled slowly up the treacherous dirt driveway, their thick, heavily treaded tires crunching loudly against the frozen gravel. 4 elite archival experts, dressed in immaculate dark wool proats and carrying heavy, weatherproof steel cases, stepped out into the freezing 30-degree Fahrenheit morning air. They had driven exactly 150 miles through the pitch-black night, summoned urgently by the frantic late-night telephone calls from Margaret. They entered the farmhouse. They did not speak a single word. Upon seeing the towering, meticulously organized stacks of preserved history that filled every single square foot of the decaying parlor, a heavy, deeply reverent silence fell completely over the group of professionals. They immediately unpacked their specialized tools. For the next 8 agonizing hours, they worked with the quiet, intense devotion of monks inside a sacred temple. They used soft cotton gloves to gently examine the delicate, fading ink on the fragile paper, shining ultraviolet lights across the ancient, heavy ledgers to reveal hidden watermarks, and carefully measured the heavy iron tintypes that weighed exactly 2 pounds each. The lead appraiser, a tall, imposing man with neat silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, picked up a single, heavily rusted photograph and compared it directly to a thick stack of 19th-century land deeds. His manicured hands began to tremble violently. The incredibly detailed documents laid out before him perfectly outlined the stolen boundaries of massive, sprawling farms, measuring tens of thousands of acres of prime timberland that had been violently and illegally seized by the local elite. "This changes absolutely everything we know about the region," the lead appraiser whispered hoarsely, his eyes wide with profound, undeniable shock. "This single, miraculously preserved collection completely fills a 100-year gap in the official history of our entire state, a gap created entirely by human greed." Eleanor stood quietly by the rotting doorframe. She wore her old, frayed coat, her deeply calloused and heavily bandaged hands resting calmly by her sides. She did not display any grand, sweeping emotion, nor did she boast about her grueling, agonizing labor in the freezing dark. She simply listened as the experts painstakingly tabulated the monumental, undeniable value of Grandmother Josephine's lifelong, fiercely guarded crusade. The lead appraiser slowly removed his glasses, turned to the stoic 71-year-old woman, and delivered his final, earth-shattering verdict. "The Society is prepared to offer an immediate, unconditional acquisition and preservation buyout for the entire physical archive," he stated formally, his voice thick with deep, unwavering respect. "The initial valuation is exactly $2,500,000. The room was completely still. "Furthermore," the appraiser continued gently, bowing his head slightly, "we desperately require a chief archivist to manage the physical transition and assist with the permanent historical curation. We are officially offering you full administrative control of the facility, accompanied by an annual grant of $50,000 a year for the remainder of your natural life." Eleanor did not gasp. She did not faint. She did not scream in absolute vindicated joy, and she did not break her iron composure for even a fraction of a second. From a completely discarded, humiliated woman shivering violently in a gasoline-scented station wagon with exactly $18 to her name, she had instantly become a highly respected millionaire, holding the most vital, priceless historical legacy in the entire nation. She simply nodded her head. "That is acceptable," Eleanor replied quietly. The monumental triumph belonged entirely to the quiet, enduring strength of the women in her bloodline. However, secrets of this massive, earth-shattering magnitude are utterly impossible to keep buried in a small mountain valley. The incredible news of a $2,500,000 fortune rapidly bled out into the surrounding county, whispering through the small local banks, echoing loudly in the polished law offices, and instantly waking a very specific, deeply dangerous monster. The scent of immense wealth traveled rapidly. It reached the luxurious, completely sterile estate of a man who had laughed out loud while tossing his wife out into the freezing winter night. Sitting securely behind the steering wheel of his heavy, imported luxury sedan, his cold eyes blazing with a sudden, vicious, and completely uncontrolled greed, Arthur Sterling began to speed recklessly up the winding hills towards Oakhaven, accompanied by Beatrice and bringing with him the most despicable, underhanded legal maneuver ever drafted.
The heavy, aggressive crunch of expensive tires broke the peaceful silence of the Oakhaven Ridge. A sleek, black, imported luxury sedan, entirely unsuited for the deeply rutted, freezing dirt roads of the mountain, stopped abruptly just 50 feet from the sagging front porch. The heavy doors swung open. Arthur Sterling, wearing a flawlessly tailored cashmere overcoat that cost more than a dozen local farms, completely shielded from the bitter 28-degree Fahrenheit wind. He was not alone. Beside him stood Beatrice, the deeply practical, terrifyingly greedy 45-year-old niece who had once eagerly offered to hire a massive clearance crew to haul grandmother Josephine's legacy into a landfill. Flanking them both was a sharp, aggressive corporate attorney carrying a thick leather briefcase. Arthur walked briskly across the frozen yard, ignoring the dead weeds that brushed against his polished Italian leather shoes. He pasted a wide, incredibly fake, sickeningly warm smile across his arrogant face. He dropped the mask of cruelty entirely. "Eleanor, my darling wife," Arthur called out loudly, his rich, booming voice dripping with a highly calculated, absolutely fraudulent affection. "I have been worried sick about you out here in this freezing, God-forsaken wilderness. It is time to stop this silly little charade. Pack up your things and come back to the warmth of our home." Eleanor did not rise. She sat perfectly still on the heavy wooden rocking chair, positioned directly on the reinforced planks of the newly repaired front porch. She wore the exact same faded wool coat she had worn on the night she was cast out, her deeply calloused, heavily bandaged hands resting quietly in her lap. She looked down at him from the elevated porch, her expression an impenetrable, absolute fortress of calm. "You are legally confused, Mr. Sterling," a sharp, steady voice interrupted. Stepping out from the shadowed doorway of the crumbling farmhouse was a highly distinguished, incredibly sharp legal representative retained by the National Historical Society to manage the massive estate transfer. He walked calmly to the edge of the porch, looking down at the trio of intruders with absolute, undisguised contempt. Arthur's fake smile vanished instantly, replaced by a dark, furious scowl as he glared at the opposing counsel. "That is my wife," Arthur snapped viciously, his true, venomous nature immediately bleeding through the thin veneer of charm. "And every single piece of paper, every single photograph, and every single rusted piece of trash inside that structure is marital property. The $2,500,000 belongs jointly to the marital estate, and we are heavily prepared to freeze all assets in federal court this very afternoon." Beatrice nodded eagerly in the background. She stared hungrily at the crumbling walls of the house, practically salivating at the staggering, life-altering sum of money. Arthur crossed his arms, his chest puffing out with the supreme, arrogant confidence of a man who firmly believed he held absolute, unbreakable leverage over the woman he had tortured for 40 decades. He waited for Eleanor to break, to cry, to beg for a meager fraction of the fortune. She merely blinked. The Historical Society lawyer calmly opened his slim leather folio. He did not extract a fresh, newly drafted injunction, nor did he present a complex, modern legal defense. Instead, he pulled out a heavily yellowed, fragile piece of legal parchment that bore the undeniable, heavily stamped seal of the county clerk from exactly 44 years ago. "You are an incredibly meticulous man, Mr. Sterling," the lawyer stated evenly. "I always protect my assets," Arthur sneered proudly. "You certainly do," the lawyer countered smoothly, reading directly from the aged document. 44 years ago, when you ruthlessly drafted the initial ironclad separation of assets to completely isolate your own wealth from your wife, you were violently opposed to paying a severely overdue property tax on this exact 4-acre parcel. The fee at the time was exactly $7. Arthur stiffened visibly. To successfully evade that completely trivial $7 financial burden, you personally demanded the inclusion of a highly specific, legally binding, and completely irrevocable clause. I will read it aloud for the benefit of your incredibly expensive counsel. The silence was absolutely deafening. The undersigned, Arthur Sterling, hereby permanently and unconditionally waives all current, pending, or future legal claims, financial interests in the 4-acre Oakhaven property, explicitly including the physical structure and any corresponding garbage, debris, or worthless paper housed within said boundaries. He had dug his own grave. The massive, suffocating weight of absolute karma descended on the frozen yard with the terrifying force of a falling anvil. Arthur's highly paid corporate attorney instantly stopped breathing, his face draining of all color as he stared at the unassailable 44-year-old signature of his own client. The trap was absolutely flawless. By aggressively classifying Grandmother Josephine's priceless historical archive as garbage to save exactly $7, Arthur completely, legally, and permanently severed himself from the $2,500,000 fortune. The devastating truth was worse than mere lost wealth. Arthur was currently drowning in massive, completely hidden corporate investment debt. His massive estate was heavily mortgaged, his liquid assets were completely exhausted, and his highly leveraged business empire was mere days away from a brutal, highly public bankruptcy. He desperately, absolutely needed this money to survive. Without it, he was completely ruined. He completely lost his mind. "No!" Arthur screamed violently in the freezing air, his voice cracking wildly in the freezing air, spit flying from his lips as he thrashed helplessly against the absolute, undeniable reality of his own making. The sharp, dignified lawyer merely stood his ground, pointing a firm finger towards the dirt driveway, silently ordering the intruders to leave the premises immediately. Beatrice shrank back in absolute terror, utterly humiliated by the pathetic, screaming breakdown of the man she had idolized for his cruelty. Arthur looked down at him. She did not gloat, she did not raise her voice, and she did not smile at his utter destruction. She simply stared at the pathetic, screaming man thrashing in the dead weeds, her dark eyes reflecting the immense, ancient dignity of the Appalachians. It was a gaze of absolute, chilling indifference. To her, he was no longer a husband, a captor, or a monster. He was simply nothing. Completely broken, violently humiliated, and facing absolute financial ruin, Arthur Sterling slowly turned his back. He stumbled weakly towards his luxury vehicle, dragging his expensive shoes through the freezing mud, looking suddenly exactly like a frail, utterly defeated old man. They drove away in absolute silence, banished forever from the mountain. The venom was finally purged. The toxic shadow of her past vanished entirely from the ridge, leaving the cold, pristine mountain air feeling profoundly clean and incredibly light. The farm was now completely secured. Her inheritance was fiercely protected by the full legal weight of the National Historical Society, and the towering mountains of ancient paper were safe. The enemies were gone, returning the sacred space to a state of absolute peace, leaving Eleanor completely unhindered to finally begin her last, greatest labor.
Eleanor Vance was now exactly 72 years old. With absolute, unwavering control over a massive fortune measuring exactly $2,500,000, she did not purchase a sprawling, empty mansion in the wealthy suburbs. She did not acquire a fleet of imported luxury vehicles, nor did she drape herself in expensive, heavily tailored cashmere to prove her worth to a society that had completely ignored her. She poured her wealth directly into the dirt. The 4-acre property at the crest of the Oak Haven Ridge was entirely transformed. The dangerously sagging front porch was now perfectly level, heavily reinforced by massive, 12-inch thick beams of solid Appalachian oak. The peeling white paint was permanently replaced by a pristine, weather-resistant exterior that gleamed brightly under the mountain sun. At the entrance of the newly paved driveway, exactly 20 yards from the front steps, hung a beautifully carved, heavy wooden sign. It commanded absolute respect. The Josephine Memorial and Historical Archive. Inside the completely renovated, meticulously climate-controlled facility, the ambient temperature remained at a perfectly comfortable 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The terrifying, dangerous mountains of rotting cardboard were entirely gone. In their place stood magnificent, towering rows of custom-built, solid cherry wood shelving that stretched majestically toward the heavily reinforced ceiling. Silas had built every single shelf. The quiet carpenter stood silently in the main viewing hall, his deeply weathered hands resting proudly upon the smooth, polished wood he had shaped. A few feet away, Margaret sat comfortably behind a heavy mahogany desk, carefully handing a heavily protected, perfectly restored 19th century land deed to a quietly weeping family. They had finally found the undeniable physical proof of their deep indigenous roots in the valley. The erased souls were finally home. Outside, a brilliant, fiery orange sunset slowly descended behind the towering peaks of the rugged mountains, casting long, deeply peaceful shadows across the pristine yard. Eleanor sat comfortably in a heavy, solid oak rocking chair on the sturdy front porch. She held a beautifully painted porcelain mug of hot steaming tea in her calloused, permanently scarred hands. She took a slow, deep breath. Exactly 9 miles down in the lower valley, a battered, violently sputtering compact car dragged itself pitifully along the county highway. Inside sat a thoroughly bankrupt, completely broken man, constantly fleeing his massive, inescapable financial debts. Arthur Sterling occasionally looked up at the ridge with bitter, hollow eyes, knowing deep within his dark soul that he had foolishly thrown away an entire kingdom to save exactly $7 miserable. Eleanor did not even turn her head. She simply watched the fading golden light, feeling the absolute, towering strength of the mountains settling deeply into her tired bones. Her mind was exceptionally clear, her conscience was absolutely clean, and her spirit was completely, eternally free. From 18 pathetic dollars and being thrown out onto the freezing street to sleep in a damp, gasoline-scented vehicle, this woman had proven an absolute, undeniable truth, a truth forged entirely in the bitter cold. The wicked may mercilessly strip away your physical assets, but they can absolutely never strip away the quiet, enduring power of a patient soul. And the greatest, most magnificent rewards are always meticulously hidden in the exact places where the arrogant have already turned their backs and walked away.